Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. There's no football game. Where is everybody? But they're cold, right? But those of you who are here are going to have a treat. I'm Louise Court, Curator for Ceramics at the Freer and Sackler. And first of all, I want to wish you all a Happy New Year. That wild, up and down Year of the Dragon is leaving us finally. And peacefully sliding Year of the Snake. Somebody wrote a message, we'll all shed our cares in the Year of the Snake. I guess the image was a snakeskin, but I hope it's true, and I hope it's a good year for all of you. And indeed, we chose this day when we were thinking about a possible day for its proximity to the new year to celebrate. Today we're presenting a talk by Mei-ling Hom and David McClelland called, as you can see, Contemporary Korean Ceramics. This is part of a rather large Korea-related project at the museums over the past couple of years. We've already opened a new installation of our Korean ceramics in Gallery 14, and very soon, on a date to be announced, we're going to publish the first guidebook of our collections, which will be a guidebook to the Korean collections. And that guidebook will be associated with our first ever app, which will also be about the Korean collections. And we're also putting up a website of all of the Korean ceramics in our collection, about 300 works. So you have those things to look forward to. But very important, in this whole program, to me, was the chance to invite Mei-ling and David to talk about their encounter with contemporary Korean ceramics. This is a talk I've been looking forward to myself for a long time, ever since I heard that Mei-ling and David were headed to Korea with a Fulbright for a year of research in 2007, 2008, to look at the activity of contemporary Korean ceramics artists, document them, produce something that could be used by people in this country teaching ceramics and desperately in need of more information about what was going on. And I think that still is the case. And so this is a rare chance to see close up and firsthand the range of wonderful things that Korean potters are doing. Mei-ling Hom studied ceramic sculpture at Kirkland College and then spent 15 years in Philadelphia working in clay primarily before she went back to Alfred University to get her MFA. And then she came back to Philadelphia and went on working with clay, with any other materials. And many of you will remember her for the beautiful installation in the Sackler Pavilion in 2005, the installation called Floating Mountains Singing Clouds, of wire clouds that floated above that space, intertwining with specially commissioned music by a young composer named Eli Marshall. It was a really unforgettable installation. David provided me his own way of introducing him, so I'm going to quote it literally. He got his BA from Hamilton College and a master's in library science from Drexel University. He is an interterrestrial imaging librarian, an art librarian, a carpenter, a farmer companion to a million adventures with Professor Hom. Indeed, David and Mei-ling travel throughout Asia, looking and doing their own work. And if you happen to travel through the Philadelphia airport or the Raleigh-Durham airport, look up because you'll see installations there by Mei-ling, ably assisted by David. And at the same time, for part of the time every year, they live in upstate New York where they grow organic garlic, buckwheat, quinoa, and other crops. So you can learn more about Mei-ling's work on our blog called Bento, which is on the homepage of our website. But I welcome Mei-ling and David to talk with us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Louise, for making this possible, and thanks for everyone showing up today. We have a lot of slides to look at today, and I'd like to try and be able to give you a little bit of an overview. But one thing that I wanted to point out is that we do have these CDs available, which we're distributing free today to all of you lucky people who showed up. So they're right up here front. Afterwards, just come up and pick up one of these CDs. The CD contains 25 of the artists that we interviewed, whom we interviewed during our travels in Korea during the Fulbright year, 2007-2008. And what we're looking at today, we'll briefly introduce 17 of them, and then the last 8 we'll look at a little bit more closely, just so that you have an idea of the range of work. One thing about Korea, Korea is full of potters. Just as an example, there is just one university out of 37 in Seoul alone that has 200 ceramic graduates, 200 ceramic majors a year. I don't know any American universities that has 200 ceramic majors, not even Alfred. And you sort of think, if they're churning out this amount of people really interested in clay, you can imagine that, the country, the culture has a great awareness of ceramics. So to get started with, we're going to go through just some really brief introductions of those first 17. And afterwards, we'll have some time for question and answers, okay? This is Chung Hyun, and she was a emerita professor at Ewha University in Seoul, which is one of the most preeminent women's universities. And she's working with ongi clay, using this inlay technique called sangam.
Won Hyung Hwan is a professor at Hongik University. Hongik is the art university, which is based in Seoul, and he works primarily in large sculptural installations, although, as with many other Korean artists, he also does utility work. And this is Hyung Joo. Hyung Joo is an artist not associated with the university. He lives in southern Korea in a wonderful, abandoned 1960s elementary school, just like the one I went to. And he works in this large utilitarian mode called ongi, which is used for food preparation and storage.
Shin Chul is an artist who's actually educated here in the United States at the University of Washington in Seattle. And he does large installations of this, so you see that not everyone is working just with ongi.
Hyung Joo is one of the first people we met and interviewed. It turns out he's a potter of our generation. He's depicted first there in his own field of ongi jars that he collects, but his own work is smaller. This is called yolimon, which involves embedding colored clays within the body and then scraping them down till they form a pattern.
Park Jae-duk. Park Jae-duk is, he received both of his degrees, his BFA and his master's degree from here in the US, from the Philadelphia College of Art and then from Cranbrook Academy. He teaches down in the southern part of South Korea in Busan at the university there. And he makes, this is just a small section of these large, kind of really organic installation pieces.
Pak Suk-hoo has worked primarily in Scandinavia, Although he was educated first in Korea, his work derives very strongly from a Northern European porcelain tradition. He now teaches back in Seoul. He was called at 3 o'clock in the morning, where he was living in Sweden, and offered a job in the university. And in 15 minutes, he accepted and moved around the world. He said he felt he owed it to his own country to bring back some of the things that he'd been taught and to bring some knowledge of what was being done in Scandinavia.
Resu Jeong. Resu Jeong is one of these loose cannons. So many of the artists that we met in Korea were often connected with some kind of university. He did study at Hongik University, but instead of following the teaching path, he's an independent artist and is known for this really strong calligraphic brushwork and the iron glaze.
Lee Myung-ah, as you can see as when we'll show her work, has been strongly influenced by her graduate education in New York City. All of her sculptural work relates to buildings, the built environment, skyscrapers, the tight cities. And when you see the view from her apartment and you see the environment she lives in, you understand completely how it translates to clay.
This is Chae Sung-jae. Chae Sung-jae teaches down in Buyo, which is on the southwestern side of the peninsula. And his university is the National Heritage Korean Heritage University. But he's known for his really strong brushwork using the buncheong method, where he's drawing through the wet slip with his fingers. And you'll see on that lower left-hand side that little trademark duck that he has on all of his pieces.
Eun Mi is one of a newer generation of potters. She's not in love with the idea of firing. In fact, she calls fired clay pollution. She thinks it's going to be around forever. And both these works, the first ground work and the second work, are in unfired clay, which she leaves to be dissolved by the rain.
This is Jungsook. Jungsook also studied at the major fine art faculty, Hongik University in Seoul, but then went to Japan for his master's training. And he actually spent quite a few years in Japan and doesn't feel any real strong allegiance to being labeled just a Korean potter. I think he feels more sort of globally anchored. But he makes these odd little figures based on an old Chinese classical text.
Kwan Cho is someone who is fairly well known both in the United States and Korean ceramic circles. He had an exhibition in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But he lives in a small isolated valley he calls Windy Valley, and he works in a Buddhist tradition. These are sutras scratched through a layer of white slip applied over his big sculptural pieces.
Daejung, a young up-and-coming artist. He teaches at both Hongik and at Konkut universities. His work has been featured at the Icheon Biennial, and he's known for these figurative forms. And they always have these narratives. This was actually a memory of a small cat that he found caught in a snare.
Kim Taehoon is another of our loose cannons. He's not affiliated with the university, and as you can tell by changing the color of his hair, everyone has black hair in Korea, he's standing out from the crowd. He does work which is not very easy to categorize. He sometimes does commercial work, he sometimes does figurative work, he sometimes does sculptural work.
This is Gil Dong. Gil Dong is emeritus faculty from Seoul National University of Technology. And he's been working in ceramics for many, many years. And his ideas, he has this theory of transmigration, which I think is connected to his Buddhist philosophies, which he, working through a translator, it's a very obscure kind of theory to get through.
Eun Chung is another younger artist who has been educated first in Korea and then in the United States, where he went to the San Francisco Art Institute, which was quite a shock for him. But he survived the shock, he bettered his English, and he really mastered a very interesting way of looking at large-scale sculpture, which he is exhibiting now in a museum that was being built on the site next to his studio when we interviewed him. In fact, we were trapped in his driveway by the truck pouring cement for the afternoon.
So we're going to start on just a closer look at 8 of the artists that we actually interviewed. And we have quite a few more slides of each. I'm going to be reading from some of the texts that we actually put together, and David will be clicking through these, okay? So we're first looking at Kim Daejung. Kim Daejung was born in Japan to a Korean family and spent her childhood in Japan speaking Japanese before moving to Korea at age 11. Her lifelong fight against chronic illness was now further complicated by a need to learn a new language and integrate into a new culture. Always aware that she was not a perfect fit in any group, she strove to capture a sense of personal identity by widespread reading and exploring the creative world. Although she felt a strong sense of pleasure in making physical objects, art was only one of her numerous interests. Because her father was a social scientist and she explored the fields of sociology and psychology, while at the same time indulging a childhood fascination with nature. At Ewha Women's University in Seoul, she turned to clay as a medium to express herself. The decision to pursue an interest in the crafts came in an attempt to slow the pell-mell pace of her life. It seemed to Kim Daejung that ceramic art was a choice that would allow her to spend a great deal of time really mastering a subject. The demands of a liberal arts education at Ewha meant that she spent less time in the ceramic studio than she would have contributed to a more well-rounded education than some students receive at more specialized art schools. Although she studied with a number of different professors, she felt there was an emphasis on indirect methods of forming clay through the use of molds. Because she was most interested in throwing rather than mold making and slip casting, she chose to go to Tokyo Art University for her graduate study. She was also curious to experience Japan as an adult and to explore her place in that culture. The pace and demands of work in Tokyo were hard, but she remembers an exceptional sense of community and concentration. There was no calendar, there were no days of the week, only glazing day, firing day, and then all over again. Her liberal arts graduate education had not provided any direct experience in firing kilns or formulating glazes, and she was at a distinct disadvantage vis-a-vis her Japanese classmates. The hard work necessary to catch up consumed all her time, but her dedication and superb throwing skills brought her not only an MFA, but also the first PhD that Tokyo Art University awarded. At the end of her 7 years in Japan, she received 2 travel grants which allowed her to embark on a radically different path of adventure. Kim Daejung had earmarked the decade of her 20s for Japan and the decade of her 30s for Europe. So with this plan in mind, she set out to live in a cottage on the border between England and Wales to make pots. She laughs as she recalls the foggy isolation. My English didn't improve very fast, but I learned a few words of sheep and some cow. She spent 3 years developing a body of throne work notable for its crisp lines and exquisite balance. The idea that she would have time to devote the intensive work was born out of the quiet existence actually proved quite challenging. Speaking of the peace needed for creative work, Kim Hae-jung says that the potter creates it within, and that country life can actually be as busy as New York. After 3 years of inexpensive life in the countryside, she moved to London, where she soon became a member of the active craft community and started to show regularly while teaching classes and working as a studio assistant. She still maintains a schedule of exhibitions in London and works to keep her network alive. For Kim Hae-jung, the pots she makes are the outcome of a very contemplative process. Making clay, preparing the studio, and then sitting and throwing pots is a way of finding inner peace. She feels that the interplay between the order and regularity of her pieces and the small bumps and holes and lugs and nipples that she builds into them is the key that emphasizes the form in a subtle manner. Although she has worked in many spots around the globe, Kim Hae-jung emphasizes that her aesthetic is a direct outgrowth of her bicultural Korean and Japanese background. She imbues her pots with a life, calling them almost human, full of further insight. She returned to Seoul in 2007 and set up to be closer with her family. She set up a studio there, but now she also maintains a sort of a small factory studio in Japan, and she travels back and forth, besides returning also to England.
That's her website.
Yeah, that's her website if you want to look up any more of her work.
Okay. When we journeyed to visit Eok Geo and his wife Seong Yeol Gun in their adjoining studios in an area south of Seoul, we started off in a futuristic bus station, passed through an increasingly rural landscape, and as we turned up the little road to their own village, we were actually blocked in our tracks by an ox pulling a sled. It was practicing for a sled competition, drawing weights, a Korean idea. But it's a good introduction to the counterforces of tradition and modernity in Korean ceramics. Eok Geo is a master of the ongi forming technique, historically utilized to produce a full range of pottery used in fermenting and storing many of the ingredients of Korean cuisine. Yet his production is rarely, if ever, aimed at the utilitarian market. Instead, he's always striven to use the traditional techniques to produce something completely modern, something that is an emotional statement rather than a mundane reiteration of traditional shape. Both Eok Geo and Seong Yeol Gun graduated from Hongik University in Seoul, generally regarded as Korea's top art school. After finishing his mandatory military service, Eok Geo sought out an ongi master near the southern city of Busan to teach him the techniques used to produce ongi vessels. He explained that in that era of violent student protests and discontent with the repressive dictatorship, the ongi workers assumed that a university student who chose to leave the capital and work at manual labor must be avoiding arrest. He was treated sympathetically and spent 3 years learning the techniques and refining his abilities to form very large vessels by coiling and paddling. During this time, the couple married and set up a housekeeping in a single room. Both laugh as they describe their struggle to keep the wolf from the door by throwing utilitarian ware and driving it to Seoul to sell enough to earn so that Eok Geo could continue researching the ongi technique. Seong Yeol Gun developed a style of elaborately engraved celadon ware, highlighted with 2 or 3 underglaze colors, that she's continued to sell to this day. She regrets that Korean society awards the dominant role to the male partner and hopes that things are changing so that her daughter, who's on the threshold of pursuing ceramic studies in college, will have an equal chance. After the ongi workshop closed, Eok Geo continued to try and develop his own style and establish himself as an independent artist, but lacking the resources to build his own studio, he, along with his wife, worked in the studio of their former professor, Shin Sang Ho, for 3 years. You'll meet Shin Sang Ho later in this presentation. They built a studio after leaving Shin Sang Ho, and after an additional 3 years of development on his own, Hyung Joo finally felt he was competent to call himself an artist. His belief that 10 years is the minimum period of development necessary before really commencing a career puts him at odds with the modern generation bent on stardom at an early age. His present workshop is the result of his own labor, little by little, over the years, much of the building being his own labor. An impressive example is the wood kiln, which is formed out of thousands of high-fired kaolin cones mortared together with fire clay. The interior of the kiln is now glazed with the ash of myriad firings, and the effects bring to mind honeycomb, glistening with dark honey. In front of their respective studios stands the traditional house that they've converted to a gallery after moving to larger quarters nearby. Sitting on the heated floor, sipping tea and chatting, we're impressed by the rural tranquility and the beautiful view out across the flower-filled garden. It's easy to understand why Hyung Joo has turned his back on the bustle of his native Seoul and opted to pursue his dream in this landscape of rice fields and wooded hills. Hyung Joo is best known for a large body of work using white slip applied over a dark body in vigorous smears and swirls that record an intimate history of the potter's touch. Under the last dynasty of Korea, which collapsed at the coming of the 20th century, this type of white slipped ware, known as buncheong, was produced by the commoners in imitation of the pure white porcelain used by the upper classes. Produced quickly, it was given a roughly brushed white coating, which imparts an air of great liveliness to the pieces. A related scheme of decoration involves filling depressions stamped or beaten into the surface of the soft clay with white slip, and then scraping back the surface to produce a crisply defined white pattern against the darker clay body. Both of these decorative schemes have received a contemporary twist at the hands of Hyung Joo. A slender, intense man with a thoughtful air, he undergoes a change as he vigorously lathers 6-foot-tall pots with white slip, often ending up as decorated with slip as the pots themselves. The resultant character of the decoration is as fluid as flowing water and as complex as textile patterning. His studio compound is lined with scores of examples of his work. Pausing by a large, strongly patterned jar slightly distorted by the forces of the wood firing, he mentions that this is his favorite pot. Asked why this one out of the many examples lining his storage rooms and courtyards is his favorite, he responds that it shows most clearly the artist's spirit, both in its formation and in its patterning. This is the key to Hyung Joo's art. The direct sense of the emotional vitality of the artist is transmitted to the viewer through the shaping of the soft clay, the vigor of the decoration, and the transmutation of the firing process.
Okay, our next artist is Hwoarang Upson. As a child, Hwoarang Upson was keenly interested in art, despite the opposition that his parents, who felt that an artist's life would be hard and poor. This is a bit ironic because his grandfather owned a porcelain factory, and this would seem to set the stage for a story of love for traditional ceramics passed down through the generations. But this isn't this tidy story that Hwoarang Upson dismisses and influenced with the family background. Instead, the studious and shy young scholar spent a great deal of time exploring the natural surroundings of Seoul, which at that time had not enveloped the scenic mountains and river valleys which rimmed that city. His appreciation of music, nature, philosophy, and religion led him to explore the whole gamut of liberal arts at Seoul National University. But something in ceramics awakened his artistic talent, and he received both BFA and MFA before taking time off for his compulsory military service. But then, at this point, he fell in love with German ceramics after seeing a traveling exhibition and meeting a charismatic professor. I started all over again, he explains, as he describes his move to Germany and the 14 semesters of ceramics that he took there. He did a complete study all over again. Although he mentions the hard work necessary to learn the German language and the inevitable culture shock of ending up halfway around the world, his face lights up as he talks about the benefits of concentrating his entire attention on mastering the German ceramic curriculum. Now Hwoarang Upson is part of both cultures, teaching in Seoul and maintaining a studio and family in Germany. His wife, Kang Si-suk, who is also a ceramic artist, is a Korean whom he met in Germany. Although he admits that two artist families can produce a bit of rivalry, the two show together on occasion, and he mentions that the burden of an upcoming show is cut in half because his wife has to take up the other half of the space. The influence of Germany is immediately apparent in the studio which he has equipped at the ceramics faculty at Seoul National University. It's clean and sleek with white cabinetry, reminiscent of a laboratory. The studio is a bustling scene with students working on complicated casting machinery and computer-controlled modeling devices. Glazed canisters are perfectly aligned on their shelves with labels giving the chemical name in Latin, Korean, English, and German. Hwoarang Upson is particularly proud of the glazed chemistry course, which is much more rigorous than those in other Korean universities. We have developed hundreds of glazes because an intimate fit between glaze and piece is important both physically and visually, he explains. It is quite evident that the untold hours that he has spent at the university teaching, refitting the studios, and mentoring the students reflect his belief that during the months he spends in Korea, he is not an artist, but he is a teacher. While his demands for hard work and intellectual rigor might seem daunting, many of his students express their appreciation of this professor who drives himself just as hard. The students, the fact that his sly grin often breaks through his serious demeanor and his habit of sitting down in the studio amongst his students to quietly make work as they make their own work also combine to mellow this image. His work has spanned a wide range since his graduation from Seoul National University, from raku to installation to functional wear, but it is in design and production of porcelain that he is best known. Partly a result of his exposure to porcelain by working in Meissen and Fürstenberg, and partly because of his exposure to the rich tradition of porcelain in Korean history, Hwoarang Upson seems to have a natural affinity for working with this simple and difficult material. Much of his recent work has explored the possibilities of combining different colored porcelain bodies in simple cylindrical shapes. By repeatedly cutting a cylinder and inserting contrasting pieces, he has created a spare but lively repertoire. Some of the methods by which he creates are deceptively simple final pieces, are so laborious it's really difficult to believe. The slightest slip would immediately be evident and would definitely totally spoil the effortless appeal of the elegant shape. Well suited to the environment created by Northern European interior design, they have been repeatedly honored in shows in Europe. The surface treatments that he applies to the pieces are rarely glazed. Some of the cylinders have fine matte unglazed surfaces, and some are hand-polished with diamond abrasive packs to produce a dull gleam that can emphasize the flow lines in the uncolored porcelain body. Some of the pieces also feature colored body sections where the colorant is unevenly mixed to create linear patterns reminiscent of metamorphic rocks. When we asked Hwoarang Upson whether his work was Korean, we evoked a long discussion of the burden of tradition on Korean artists and the duty of contemporary artists to free themselves from feeling that they have to pursue some kind of nationalistic agenda. He studied in Korea and he studied in Germany. He teaches and works in Korea and he works in his studio in Germany. Seeing himself as a bridge between two cultures and valuing both, he maintains that his work is truly his own. So, there. Now we're next.
Shin Sang Ho.
I was just going to say, we're next going to move on to this rather charismatic but very controversial figure.
It's appropriate that we first meet Shin Sang Ho at the opening of the Shin Sang Ho exhibition at the Clay Arch Gimhae Museum, because this moment should represent the apex of his art career. Given in the 60th year of his life, a very significant and auspicious year in Korean culture, the exhibition occupied the entire museum and cast a look back over two distinct bodies of work which have occupied Shin Sang Ho in recent years: three-dimensional animal sculptures and brightly colored glazed tiles. The grand reception, the beautiful catalog, the haute couture, commemorative t-shirt, the glittering guest list would all seem to point to a moment of personal triumph. But in characteristic fashion, Shin Sang Ho delivers a speech so critical of the Korean art establishment that he's subsequently forced out of his teaching position at Hwoarang University. This is not the first time the controversy has broken out around the artist, who describes his critics in print as blood-sucking scum. Yet even his critics admit no one else has had such a huge impact on the ceramic art scene in the last 30 years. From his early years operating a workshop producing celadon and buncheong wares, to his present situation overseeing a vast atelier replete with a staff of assistants, manufacturing his sculptures and painting the brilliant stripes on his tile assemblages, he has represented the vanguard of change in Korean ceramics. The force of his personality is evident in his decision to defy his well-to-do family and choose to pursue a life in ceramics. After he disappeared from the family home and was eventually discovered in a potter's village south of his native Seoul, his father capitulated, bought a workshop for him to run. He received his BFA and MFA from Hwoarang and married a fellow Hwoarang student, Han Jungsook, who's played a key role in his sometimes lonely crusade against complacency in the Korean ceramic world. He served only one of his 3 years of mandatory military service because the Korean Army summarily ejected him, weary after transferring this anti-authoritarian youth 10 times in 12 months. Plunging into the work of modernizing traditional buncheong and celadon wares, his workshop produced pots so popular he couldn't keep up with demand. Many now prominent potters have spent periods of their own time working as assistants in his workshop before leaving to go out on their own. In 1980, he began teaching at Hwoarang University and eventually served as dean and chairman of the ceramics department. With his wife, he bought a plot of land in secluded mountains north of Seoul, diametrically opposed to the towns south of Seoul, long known for their ceramic industry. Shin Sang Ho began a construction streak that ran for decades. Slow down. Besides a house and initial workshop buildings and a long climbing kiln, he built a second larger house and 2 other immense studios and a museum, and now a large mass of concrete has just emerged from the formwork for what will be a gigantic display wall for his 2-dimensional pieces. His sculptures are sited all around the compound, and they are often integrated into groupings with his collection of Chinese and Korean antique stonework. On the day that we visit, the clear sun sparkles on the remnants of a recent snow, and the colors of his tile pieces, which he calls fired paintings, vibrate. Seen close up, they have small-scale texture from the effects of multiple firings and the slight surface variation of the underlying handmade tiles that isn't evident when seen from afar. It is these giant, brightly striped tiles that cover the exterior of the Clay Arch Gimhae Museum and convert the modernistic round building into a living tribute to its director, Shin Sang Ho, and his vision of the fusion between the fields of architecture and ceramics. Originally, this museum was intended as a government facility to present the historical culture of the area around Gimhae, the so-called Gaia culture. But when he took over as the director, he metamorphosed it into a personal monument. And it was at this facility that we attended his 60th anniversary crowning speech. But it is interesting that he presents a series of modernistic shows such as Dreaming Toilets about altered plumbing fixtures and Spirit of Africa, which featured a full-scale mud mosque built by a team of traditional builders from Mali. A fascination with Africa and things African led Shin Sang Ho to develop a large body of sculpture with animal themes after traveling through Africa during the years between 2000 and 2006, collecting thousands of artifacts and handiworks and immersing himself in the dusty red aura of the continent. He created a number of series of 6 to 8 foot high totemic pieces topped with ram heads. Fields of lumpishly modeled animals and groups of running or standing quadrupeds, which he worked on during this phase, not only refer to Africa, but harken back to his previous interest in roughly constructed horse-like figures, which he has produced in herds.
This is the website if you want to look up more work about Shin Sang Ho.
This is Kimi Kyung. She is a fellow graduate of Alfred with Mei-ling, so they share something in common, and every time we went out drinking, it was called an alumni reunion.
We didn't graduate the same year. Kimi Kyung is one of Korea's most widely known contemporary ceramic artists. In 2004, she was named Artist of the Year, along with fellow ceramic artist Hyung Joo. In recognition of this honor, a major exhibition of her work was mounted in the Contemporary Art Museum in Seoul. Her works can be found in major art collections and museums around the world. Kimi Kyung is both artist and designer. At 73 years old, she rises every morning at 7, and she can be found working in her studio 5 days a week. She creates one-of-a-kind porcelain forms and also maintains a production line of her elegant vessels. Her present factory studio is nestled in the hills past Haeri Art Valley, close to the North Korean border. This is the third studio Kimi Kyung and her brother have built. The former studios, located successively closer to central Seoul, were nudged to the perimeters and then out of the city, with the expansion of Seoul's population and the accompanying real estate building boom. Her brother, Kim Dae-uk, is a trained sculptor, now manages the factory, which employs 15 workers, including a master mold maker, slip casters, glaze painters, the factory cook, and 2 assistants who work directly with Kimi Kyung. This is actually her shop in Seoul. The day we visited Kimi Kyung, she was working on a large mural commission for a church in Seoul. Like so many public art commissions, the deadline for this artwork was unrealistically short. So the artist and the team of assistants had been working day and night to resolve the design and glaze decisions for this mammoth wall. She worked on the clay models for the wall mural tiles by carving a huge, thick-walled clay cylinder with a long, hand-forged steel knife. Working from schematic drawings, she cut through the heavily grogged clay to produce her characteristic faceted surfaces. To achieve the subtle details so important to her work, the carved cylinder was cut into 4 equal sections, which were then allowed to slump or flatten out on wear boards. This method subtly alters the straight facets into concave surfaces while still retaining the freshness of the knife cut. Her progress to her present commanding position in Korean clay world has been a long and circuitous one. She studied chemical engineering in college and felt drawn to explore the relatively new field of glaze chemistry and managed to receive a 1-year fellowship to Alfred University in New York. At the end of that year, as all the other Korean students in American schools returned to Korea, Kimi Kyung, she managed to receive permission to stay at Alfred to finish her master's degree. But on her return to Korea, this outspoken young woman with an MFA from Alfred She was far too threatening to the male-dominated ceramic departments. She approached for teaching jobs, and instead she ended up spending 3 years at the National Museum of Korea, surrounded by all the ancient Joseon pottery. And this may have turned out to be a blessing in disguise. But trying to resume her artistic career without having a kiln or studio facilities of her own, she worked on weekends in potters' villages of Icheon near Seoul. She finally did meet up with Daniel Rhodes, her old Alfred professor, who was visiting Korea, and he arranged for her to study in Japan. During this time, she started to develop a body of work which gained her the chance for her first significant exhibitions. Again, she tried to return to the US to teach, but was denied an entry visa by the restrictive American immigration quotas. And she abandoned her dream of coming to New York City to teach at Greenwich House, and returned to Korea, where she obtained a position at Kookmin University. There she taught for 25 years while producing a large body of work, exploring the hand-built and altered vessel. Still vigorously producing large porcelain vessels and directing a factory producing her designs, she laughingly denies superhuman powers and muses about the lack of time needed to complete all her daily tasks and yet make revolutionary changes in the direction of her work. So Kimi Kyung is still going strong and still making a lot of her famous whiteware. And backwards. So we're next meeting Lee In-chin, who is actually this year's director of the Icheon Biennial.
It's hard to imagine Lee In-chin as a skinny, quiet little boy who spent so much time by himself. He was born in Korea, but actually grew up in Southern California when his family moved to an area near Los Angeles. And it was in the California school system that he was introduced to both wrestling and clay work. The physicality of both was key to changing him into the lusty, gregarious potter who was a student favorite at Hwoarang University in Seoul. It might seem to be a complicated story on trans-Pacific migration and cultural adaptation, but it's actually a very simple story. Lee In-chin loves clay. When we visit his rural studio an hour south of Seoul, we're amazed but never surprised at the amount of new work since our last visit. Lee In-chin derives a very evident pleasure from rising before dawn to work in his studio, throwing vast swelling jars or rows of plates or cups or bowls, stacking them to improbable heights on ware carts and stray surfaces. Some of the work is gas-fired, but most of it is exposed to the heavy ash buildup of his famously long 5 to 6 day wood firings. The rich range of color changes from the flashings of the flames and the interesting ash effects are hallmarks of his ceramic style. When viewed in his jam-packed storerooms with their weak light, the pots have a rich gleam that suggests Alibaba's cave. A recent installation piece of his at the 2007 World Ceramic Biennial in Icheon was a simple but massive set of rusty steel shelves crammed with his pots, their magnificent swelling forms giving the same sense of pleasure gained on opening a newly fired kiln. A pleasure in making clay work and a desire to experience his native Korea had led him to transfer from Cal State Fullerton to Hwoarang University in 1981, when he was a very rare foreign student, albeit one of Korean ancestry. His experiment in integrating into Korean society proved successful, and he stayed at Hwoarang for his MFA before going to Japan to learn the wood-firing technique of bizen, well evident in the swelling pots. He had no trouble adapting to the strict routine and heavy physical demands of being a potter in Japan. Lee In-chin has been firing his own kiln 3 times a week in high school as he made all the pottery for his parents' restaurant in California. He says some of it still resurfaces in flea markets around the LA area. His busy life was further compounded by assuming a full-time teaching job at Hwoarang when he returned to Seoul. Because he feels the responsibility of a teacher is to share knowledge, there are always 2 or 3 students who work in his large studio complex. They perform studio duties and do shifts on the wood-firing crew. Unlike some other potters who use students as production workers, Lee and Shin lets the students make their own work and allocates them kiln space. Learning to fire a kiln is a rare opportunity in the Korean education system, since most universities have kiln technicians, and only 2 or 3 universities in the entire country have wood kilns. One student jokingly grumbled as he planted cabbage in the sun that he didn't know whether he was a farmer or potter, but all the students see the studio system as a way to lengthen and deepen their experience with clay. Because he was raised and educated in both Korea and America, Lee and Shin feels at home in both countries and operates quite successfully in both cultures. Yet it's clear he enjoys a freedom in Korea from the sometimes overly regimented and stratified world of Korean academics and artists that stifle those who are not comfortable reaching out for international careers. In an interview at his office at Hwoarang University, he says, "I don't want to retire from here," meaning he doesn't see the necessity of teaching until the retirement age of 65, so as to retain the Confucian prestige of being a professor. He muses about the possibility of finding a more remote and quieter studio somewhere in the mountains surrounding Seoul. It's hardly likely that he would become a hermit with only the birds for company. An ongoing fascination with Chinese ceramic tradition has led him to forge many relationships with Chinese artists and to invest in a time-sharing studio in the city of Jingdezhen. And if that isn't enough, there are also the many opportunities afforded to him by his numerous contacts in the United States. There's really only one certainty about his future plans. They all involve Lee and Shin, his arms bared, plunging into a joyful bout with clay. As you see, a wrestling pot.
This last shot, I just want to, is one of Lee and Shin's installation pieces that he's actually really been showing a lot more, and it's kind of a natural outgrowth of what his studio looks like, what his storeroom looks like. Our next artist is a young artist in his early 30s named Eun Sol. Eun Sol is a graduate of Seoul National University. Winding through the narrow residential streets around Seoul National University, we arrive at a modest, low-rise apartment building. Our destination is the studio of Eun Sol, which is located in the basement of this building. Although its windowless space is brightly lit with high ceilings and concrete walls painted white. And you can see here it's simply this one single table. He has a very small space. Eun Sol is a young Korean artist who creates delicate sculptures using slip-cast porcelain modules. He is a recent graduate of Seoul National University, completing his BFA, MFA degrees in 2002 and 2006, and he has just completed his doctoral degree in 2012. Our long discussion of his work and working habits touches on his love of the tactile qualities of constructing sculpture from porcelain. Although both his father and brother are traditional Korean-style painters, Eun Sol has always enjoyed making three-dimensional objects. Since childhood, he's always built model cars and airplanes from kits, a practice that he feels keeps his coordination sharp and his hand somehow, that facility working. His facility with his handmade tools, which he jokingly calls his third hand, is evident in the flawless surfaces, of his intricate assemblages. Most of his current work, which follows on ideas first developed in graduate school, is based on the alteration of repetitive spherical modules, which group together to form large masses, bringing to mind the proliferation of cells. The modules are joined and cut away to reveal the byplay between the concave and the convex, something that Eun Sol feels is central to understanding his work. Although the porcelain is glazed and sometimes has colorant added to change the body color, all the work is monotone and the colors are very subtle. I should also make note here that Eun Sol is a student of that last artist we saw, Hwoarang Upson, who studied in Germany, and you probably can see some of the influence here. Working with molds and slip-cast modules requires both a strong ability to pre-visualize the final piece and great dexterity to manipulate and join fragile porcelain castings without distorting or scarring them. Add to this the absolute need for a clean and orderly studio to avoid contaminating the porcelain slip, and the rigorous discipline to maintain the schedule needed to cast, join, dry, and fire the porcelain pieces to avoid cracking. And you can picture the challenges Eun Sol has had to overcome to produce this body of work, which actually in the Fourth World Ceramic Biennial in Icheon in 2007, he took one of the 7 special prizes. And so I think he's an artist really to keep an eye on here. And this is his website, but that website is under construction.
Seong Yeol Gun is as far from Eun Sol as you can imagine. It may seem like a fantasy out of the Whole Earth catalog, living in a verdant mountain valley, spending half your life being a rice farmer and the other half making pottery. But that's day-to-day reality for Seong Yeol Gun. This is his house. It derives from a traditional building method called hanok, which you see all over Korea, although it's disappearing these days. He built it himself in the village he grew up in. He farms the rice farm that his parents left to him. And these are cakes of soybean concentrate hanging from the eaves of his house. This will be used later in the year to feed his family. And you can see the wood that he uses to heat the house. It's a simple life, a little bit akin to what a lot of the writers in Japan who wrote on folk pottery assumed that potters must have in rural districts. The leaning objects that you see jutting out of the foundation, just about the middle of the picture, is the chimney for the subfloor heating. And this is his kiln. It's a multi-unit Anagama-style kiln, but built in a traditional Korean method by heaping up little cones of high fire material that are then cemented over. But being Seong Yeol Gun, he felt that it was boring without some decoration. And of course, he put his own sculptures to work, enlivening the surface. Into the walls of his house, he constructed these niches, and in the niches are a series of little representational sculptures. They are often what he considers his alter ego, aspects of his life or aspects of his Buddhist belief. His pottery has been described as technically deficient. He was not strongly schooled. He did not go to university. In fact, he has a long and rather interesting story. He was critically ill in his 20s, and when he recovered from his illness, he felt that he had to seek meaning in life. And he was just working in a job delivering gas cylinders, and one of the places he delivered gas cylinders was to a potter's studio, a potter named Hyung Joo, and he struck up a friendship with Hyung Joo. And he said, "What you do looks interesting. Think I could do that?" And when he tried, he found that he loved it. Hyung Joo sometimes shakes his head and said, his technique, I don't know. But when you actually try to analyze this beautiful, slightly off-center, slightly lumpy, slightly rough work, it really shows the ethos of Seong Yeol Gun. It shows what a genuine guy he is, living out on the acres, farming for a living, and making pottery because he really enjoys it. Some of his customers come from the large city of Seoul, or they come from Japan, where this type of rough beauty is sought after for the tea tradition. And as you can tell, he puts emotion, he puts a lot of what he's feeling day to day into his sculpture. There are sculptures that are joyous, and there are sculptures that are depressed as well. We photographed a lot of these pieces for him. Many of the other photos you've seen are studio photographs. We photographed these because he has never had a professional photographer, and he's never been within the orbit of websites, galleries, professional photographs. This is a somewhat joyous depiction of he and his wife in a somewhat fertile moment. As a farmer, of course, that's part of what makes the world go round. And you see the rough beauty that would attract anyone who's dedicated toward the ambiance of the tea ceremony. We spent an evening at this home. His wife cooked a traditional Japanese meal.
Korean,
I'm sorry. I apologize. A Korean meal, and his children were on the other side of the table, quietly chattering while the adults spoke. And they had this joy, this quietness, but joie de vivre that boded well for their growing up well-adjusted members of a household who really understood what was important to get done each day and what was important to celebrate. As you can see, this is one of the happier days he was making sculpture.
this is kind of a signature piece that he has. He has these little smiling figures, which, at first when I saw them there, I thought they were a little bit ludicrous, but he would have them hanging all over his studio, and so he was really quite an unusual find for us, and so that's why we included him here in this closer look. But we have put together a blog spot for all the other artists who we did interview but didn't make it onto the CD. So if you'd like to go to the koreanceramicart.blogspot.com, you can see all the images and the interviews and the contact information there. And again, if anyone would like a CD, please come up and help yourself. They're here at the podium, and thank you for coming.